intelligencesquared.com.
Our next speaker, who is for the motion, saying Africa should not look to China, is Maria Gomes. She's a Portuguese member of the European Parliament, a former diplomat, and on the European Parliament she is part of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and she wrote a very important report in 2008 called China's Policies and Their Effect in Africa. Anna.
Well, thank you as well for inviting me for this interesting debate. I have no doubt that China's extraordinary growth, its capacity to lift out of poverty millions of its own citizens, becoming one of the largest exporters in manufacturing goods, acquiring the tremendous financial power it has now, definitely made it an alternative source for trade and finance to Africa. And an alternative to the traditional development and trading partners of the Africans. And in many respects, this is to be welcomed, I believe. But, and I must say, actually, China, by doing that, discovered markets in Africa at a time where many in Europe and in the US were talking about Africa as the lost continent. And it brought, definitely made available to the people in Africa very interesting and empowering tools, such as cheap mobile phones. It's not neglectable in the current era of globalization and of where the world is a global village. But in my opinion, China is not and should not be a model for development for Africa. And that is because, indeed, despite all the talk by China presenting its approach as win-win, indeed, trade and foreign direct investment of China in Africa has had a negative impact in many respects. If you look at the economic impact, it might be globally impressive, but when you disaggregate it per individual country, you see that the impact is diverse and often it's worrying. Deborah was just talking about the impact in Angola with all this construction in infrastructure. Most of that construction is very poor quality. Portuguese companies appreciate that because they actually are the ones who then have the maintenance contracts to follow on. In Zambia, people talked about the textile tsunami, the import of Chinese cheap clothes, manufactured goods, killing the production, the local production, and it's happening in other countries. Of course, there's also this factor of the bringing laborers. Sometimes, I mean, there was a Zambian leader recently elected who talked about infestors instead of investors. This is too extreme. In Angola, for instance, people have already coined the new word. They had the Portuguese word mulatto for those who were mixed, white and Angolan. Now there is the word chilato, which I think it's a good thing that shows the acceptance for, indeed, this Chinese breathing input. But I think that what is indeed very worrying is that indeed we cannot really measure, because there has been, as George said, very little transparency, not on the part only of the African countries for lack of capacities and so on, lack of governance, but indeed on the Chinese side, to publish it all so that we will know how things really operate. And for instance, a major important contract signed with the DRC, which has been subject to changes, it was about a contract of building infrastructure for about 9 billion China promised to the DRC in exchange from getting copper and cobalt, to prices unknown, but something which was calculated by the World Bank to give China in return something like 100 billion. And it has been, thanks to the pressure of the IMF, who was obviously a lender to the DRC, that there's been some publication, and there's a lot of work done by international NGOs to bring out this data, showing that indeed this contract was extremely opaque, in indefinite terms, in terms that would be terribly detrimental to the development of the DRC, if not totally exploitative. So I say that indeed we cannot rely, Africa should not rely on China to contribute to its to the governance skills that indeed development requires, because indeed the way China has been operating in Africa has dramatically increased inequality, corruption, siphoning off of funds for offshores, for tax havens. Much of the direct investment from China to Africa comes via offshores based in Hong Kong, Cayman Islands, and so on. And of course, they are indeed teaching the skills to many African leaderships to actually also siphon them off. And of course, this has also increased impunity for all sorts of abuses. And of course, I think that this has a lot to do with the fact that China itself is not a model of governance, because there are tremendous problems of human rights and accountability in China itself. And this is not at all, if you don't invest in that in developing countries, of course, you're not going to have a smooth road towards capacity building in terms of governance. This is actually weakening the states in African countries, with all these implications that I've mentioned to you. It's not just about it's about the rule of law. It's accountability, which is essential to actually fight corruption. It's about empowering civil societies. Is there any accountability? I'd love to see it. When I produced this report in 2007 for the European Parliament, I had tremendous difficulty in collecting the data. Now it might be a little better, but it would be interesting to see how for instance, how can we measure the progress that China is making in terms of the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, in its action towards Africa. I do not try to compare, and I don't want to say that the aid system, assistentialist, almost charity-based system in which the West, including the EU, has based its approach towards development in Africa is more efficient. It is not. And by the way, it has not been adhered to in practice by our own governments, despite the commitments. This is a point I make in the report as well. But definitely, at least that there are criteria. There are clear objectives in terms of goals for development, the MDGs, which have been adopted at the universal level in the framework of the UN. And by the way, China is a particularly responsible member of the UN in the sense that it is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. So don't give us this talk about non-interference and no strings attached in its policies, because we all know about the Dalai Lama, the implications if one government receives the Dalai Lama or doesn't receive it. Of course, the implications regarding Taiwan, Tibet, it's China's own human rights, serious problems, and accountability towards its own citizens. But more than that, I mean, human rights are a cornerstone of the UN. China is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. It's made a permanent member to actually interfere for human rights, interfere for peace and security and sustainable development. That's this. So don't give us this talk, Chinese government friends, that indeed this is that they have a policy of non-intervention.
Can you wrap up? You're coming to the end of your
And I'll just say that these days it's not just our African friends, and I support what George said. It's not about preventing China from doing trade and investment in Africa. It's actually about also building and helping the Africans build their own capacities to indeed be discerning in identifying their interests and in defending their interests, and not allowing, therefore, a policy to divide and rule, which has been also to deal nationally with each country. This is applied to Africa, but I would say it should apply also to us. On my way here, I read the first page of the Financial Times talking about Chinese being welcome to come and build rebuild all the infrastructure in Britain. Well, in Europe, I mean, the Europeans are in this terrible state of actually asking China to come and reinforce this so-called European Financial Stability Fund. And I think, so what I would say to our African friends is actually the same that I say to European friends. Beware of the dragon. You want the dragon, there is firepower, it's going to be good if it warms you. If it burns you and burns your house, you must be careful.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the debate somewhere in Africa, full of African academics telling us that we should or shouldn't beware the dragon. Questions?
Anna, you mentioned that you think the Chinese are teaching skills to African leaders about corruption.
Yes.
I found that a bit of a stretch. It might be going the other way around. This venture in the DRC that you mentioned, this $9 billion, which has now been negotiated down to $6 billion, you say that this is all stacked in China's favor. I don't know how you can say that if you look at the contracts, which are now widely available to see. It's 68% for the Chinese, 32% for the Congolese. They're not putting in a penny from the Congo, but they're getting 32% of this. This is a much bigger proportion than they've gotten with any other international mining contract in the DRC. So this is a good deal.
Can you respond on that?
Well, the question is, if you don't have a government in place who is able to actually identify what kind of roads, what kind of hospitals, where you're going, or the schools you're going to need, if you're going to build roads in the middle of nowhere or schools in the middle of nowhere and becoming white elephants, you don't really make much use of all that money put there in the infrastructures in exchange for the iron or the copper and cobalt, which are going to go away. And about the corruption, I don't want to say that the Chinese have the exclusive. Indeed, very important is the transparency, and indeed the fight against corruption. And the Europeans and the Westerners in general have a lot to do as well in this sense. But clearly, by now making money available to corrupt, often very corrupt governments, China is helping them perpetuate in power and actually disempower the civil society, the women, the young people, the media. That would be crucial to exercise scrutiny of government policies.
Thank you very much.